Some truths wait beneath stone, not because they are forgotten, but because something living still remembers the way they smelled in the dark. Bramble had never disobeyed Constable Callum Whitaker before. Through 5 years of patrols across the quiet streets of Ashbourne, Ontario, the German Shepherd had followed every command with the discipline of a working canine and the patience of a creature trained to trust silence before noise. He could find a missing child through wet cedar brush, identify a training scent beneath sealed containers, and sit motionless beside a school crossing while snowplows scraped past only meters away. Yet on this cool October morning, beneath a pale Canadian sky where crimson maple leaves drifted across Heritage Hill Cemetery, every lesson seemed to narrow into one quiet instinct. Callum stepped through the old, wrought iron gate carrying white lilies for his mother, Eleanor Whitaker, as he did every year on the anniversary of her passing. The air smelled of damp grass, cold stone, and pine needles gathered beneath the cedar hedge. Bramble walked at his side at first, calm and steady, his black tracking harness resting against his sable coat. Then the dog stopped, his nose lifted, his ears turned toward the eastern edge of the cemetery. Callum felt the leash tighten before he heard the low breath leaving Bramble's chest. It was not a growl. It was not fear. It was recognition of something faint, old, and hidden beneath layers of rain, frost, and time. For nearly 2 weeks, Bramble had reacted the same way whenever their patrol vehicle passed this cemetery along Heritage Road. He would rise in the rear compartment, press his nose toward the window vent, and stare past the iron fence toward the far hill. Callum had blamed squirrels, damp soil, even the strange echoes that old cemeteries gave back to the wind. The veterinarian had found nothing wrong. His fellow officers had joked that Bramble had discovered a ghost with a parking ticket. Callum smiled then. He was not smiling now. Ahead, beneath a sugar maple, Eleanor's headstone waited in its familiar patch of morning light. Callum slowed, his grip tightening around the flowers. He had come here to remember the woman who taught him that the forgotten deserved names, that kindness was not weakness, and that a good officer should listen twice before speaking once. But Bramble was no longer looking at Eleanor's grave. He was staring past it, toward a neglected corner where the older stones leaned under years of Ontario winters. "Bramble, heel," Callum said softly. The dog did not move at first. Then his body surged forward with sudden purpose. The leash slipped hard through Callum's gloved hand as Bramble pulled away from the path and moved between the rows of graves. Not wildly, not blindly, but with the focused urgency of a dog following a scent trail no human could read. "Bramble, stop." The command carried across the quiet cemetery. A pair of visitors turned near the chapel walk. From the maintenance shed, cemetery caretaker Malcolm Gervais looked up from his tools. Bramble reached a small, weathered headstone near the cedar hedge and circled once, nose pressed low to the earth. The marker bore no name, no date, no flowers, only a blank face of pale stone, half hidden by moss and fallen leaves. Bramble paused at the base of it. Then he began to dig. Callum hurried to him, heart beating harder than the moment deserved. "Enough, partner." He reached for the harness, but Bramble shifted just out of reach and continued scraping through the damp soil with controlled, insistent movements. Not panic, not play. A trained indication turning desperate because no one had understood it soon enough. Malcolm approached quickly, concern tightening his face. "Constable, the plot has been unmarked longer than I have worked here." Callum knelt beside Bramble and finally placed a steadying hand against the dog's shoulder. Beneath the thick fur, the German Shepherd trembled with effort. A final scrape of his paw loosened a clump of cold earth. Then a small, clear sound rose from beneath the ground. Metal against stone. Bramble stopped instantly. His nose hovered over the shallow opening, and for the first time that morning, he looked back at Callum. Not as if he knew the whole story, only as if he had found the first piece of it. The quiet metallic sound lingered in the cool morning air long after Bramble stopped digging. It was not loud, yet it carried enough weight to silence every conversation nearby. The German shepherd remained perfectly still, his nose hovering only a few centimeters above the disturbed soil, waiting as though his work had ended the moment the hidden object revealed itself. Callum rested one hand gently against the dog's shoulder, offering a quiet word of reassurance before looking toward Malcolm Gervais. The elderly cemetery caretaker slowly set down his shovel and stepped closer, his weathered face filled with cautious curiosity. "If there is metal beneath an old grave," Malcolm said softly, "we should uncover it carefully." Callum nodded. As a police officer, he understood that anything hidden beneath the ground could become potential evidence. Nothing would be touched without proper documentation. He photographed the location from several angles using his service phone before marking the position with a small evidence flag carried inside his patrol vehicle. Only after recording everything did he give Malcolm permission to remove the loose soil with slow, deliberate movements. Bramble quietly backed away on his own and sat beside Callum without another command. The discipline impressed everyone watching. Whatever instinct had driven him to the grave had now completely disappeared, replaced by the calm patience of a trained working dog. A few minutes later, the edge of a small rusted tin box appeared beneath intertwined cedar roots. Time had darkened its surface with rust, but the lid remained tightly closed. Malcolm carefully lifted it free, while Callum slipped on fresh evidence gloves and placed the container onto a clean evidence cloth spread across the grass. The surrounding visitors watched from a respectful distance. Nobody spoke. Even the wind seemed quieter beneath the towering maples. Callum slowly opened the lid. Inside rested 3 carefully preserved objects. A delicate silver necklace shaped like a maple leaf. A faded photograph protected inside an old plastic sleeve. And beneath both items lay a folded piece of paper wrapped inside wax cloth to keep moisture away. He removed the photograph first. It showed a young woman standing beside an elegant greenhouse framed by climbing roses at the height of summer. She smiled naturally toward the camera, unaware that someone would still be looking at her face 20 years later. Her expression held warmth rather than sadness. There was nothing about the photograph suggesting someone preparing to disappear. Next came the necklace. Malcolm quietly inhaled as the silver maple leaf caught the morning sunlight. "That is beautiful," he murmured. "Someone must have treasured it." Finally, Callum unfolded the small handwritten note with extreme care. The ink had faded but remained readable. The message contained only one short sentence. "If I disappear, please look beneath the greenhouse belonging to the richest family in town. They know why I cannot leave." There was no signature, no date, only those words. Callum read the sentence twice before carefully placing the note back onto the evidence cloth. He did not immediately think of suspects. Instead, he thought of procedure. A note alone proved very little. It raised questions rather than answered them. The identity of the writer remained unknown. The meaning behind the message remained unknown. Even the greenhouse could refer to several places that had existed decades earlier. Malcolm looked toward the unmarked headstone with growing concern. "I have cared for this cemetery for more than 30 years, he said quietly. "Nobody has ever asked about that grave." Callum sealed every item inside individual evidence bags before securing them inside his patrol case. Bramble remained beside him, relaxed now, occasionally watching drifting maple leaves crossing the grass. The dog showed no further interest in the grave, as though whatever faint scent had drawn him there had already served its purpose. Looking at his partner, Callum understood something important. Bramble had not uncovered a complete mystery. He had uncovered the beginning of one. The answers would not come from instinct. They would have to come from records, evidence, careful investigation, and people who had spent far too many years believing that no one would ever ask the right questions. By the time Callum returned to the Ashbourne Police Service detachment, the late afternoon sky had turned the color of brushed steel, and a gentle drizzle had begun to wash fallen maple leaves across the parking lot. Bramble rested quietly inside the K9 unit after receiving fresh water and a routine examination of his paws. Aside from a little dirt beneath his nails, the German Shepherd showed no sign of injury. He seemed unusually calm, almost relieved, as though the strange scent that had occupied his attention for days no longer weighed upon him. Callum secured the evidence inside the property room before requesting access to the historical archives. Every item recovered from the cemetery was logged according to procedure, photographed again under controlled lighting, and assigned temporary evidence numbers. Nothing about the discovery could move forward until every legal step had been followed. Inside the archive room, rows of steel shelving stretched beneath quiet fluorescent lights. The familiar scent of old paper, cardboard, and printer ink filled the air. Callum entered several search terms into the provincial database. Unidentified female. Heritage Hill Cemetery. Missing person. Silver maple leaf necklace. Greenhouse. Wealthy family. At first, dozens of unrelated files appeared. Most were quickly ruled out. Some involved property disputes. Others concerned cemetery records dating back decades. Then one archived investigation caught his attention. Maren Belrose, 22 years old, reported missing exactly 20 years earlier. Occupation: seasonal floral assistant employed at the Ashcroft Estate greenhouse. Investigation outcome: presumed voluntary disappearance due to insufficient evidence. Callum opened the digital case file and immediately paused. The faded portrait attached to the report matched the photograph recovered from the tin box with remarkable precision. The same gentle smile, the same greenhouse behind her, the same light-colored dress. He quietly compared the two images side by side before continuing through the investigative notes. Witness statements described Maren as dependable, thoughtful, and closely devoted to caring for her widowed mother. Co-workers remembered her arriving early each morning and rarely missing work without explanation. Nothing in the interviews suggested someone preparing to leave her entire life behind without warning. Yet, that had become the official conclusion after months without progress. One statement immediately stood apart from the others. It had been given by Maren's mother only days after the disappearance. She insisted investigators had overlooked one important detail. My daughter would never leave without her silver maple leaf necklace. It belonged to her father. She wore it every day. The original investigator noted the comment respectfully, but concluded it could not be independently verified. Callum slowly looked toward the sealed evidence bag resting beside the keyboard. The necklace recovered beneath the unmarked grave now gave those forgotten words an entirely different meaning. Still, experience reminded him not to jump to conclusions. A necklace alone did not prove where Maren had gone or what had happened to her. It simply proved one assumption from the original investigation might have been wrong. He continued reading. Several anonymous tips mentioned that Maren had grown close to Julian Ashcroft, the youngest son of the influential family who owned the estate. None of those reports contained sworn testimony. Most callers refused to identify themselves, and no physical evidence supported the rumors at the time. The investigation gradually lost momentum before being closed. Callum leaned back, allowing the silence of the archive room to settle around him. Across the hallway, Bramble quietly lay outside the office door, resting with his head upon his front paws. The dog showed no unusual behavior, no sudden alert, no mysterious reaction. His part in today's discovery had ended at the cemetery. The investigation now belonged to documents, evidence, and careful reasoning. Before shutting down the file, Callum studied the old photograph one last time. This time, his attention drifted beyond Marin herself. Behind her, partly hidden among flowering vines, stood the greenhouse mentioned in the handwritten note. Near the eastern wall, almost concealed by shrubs, he noticed what appeared to be a narrow maintenance path leading away from the building toward the wooded hillside. It was only a small detail in the background, but after years as an investigator, Callum had learned that overlooked details often carried the greatest weight. He printed the image, placed it beside the evidence file, and quietly made a note to visit the Ashcroft estate at first light. The answers would not come because Bramble had somehow known them. They would come because one forgotten clue had finally given an honest investigation somewhere real to begin. The next morning arrived beneath a blanket of low-gray clouds drifting slowly across Ashbourne, carrying the familiar scent of damp cedar and approaching rain. Callum drove the patrol vehicle north toward the Ashcroft estate, while the printed photograph rested on the passenger seat beside the evidence file. Bramble sat calmly in the rear K9 compartment, watching the countryside through the safety screen without the unusual restlessness he had shown during previous patrols near the cemetery. Whatever had drawn him to the unmarked grave no longer seemed to trouble him. His attention returned to the quiet discipline expected of a working police dog. The Ashcroft estate appeared beyond rows of mature maple trees and carefully maintained vineyards. Although the property showed signs of age, its historic stone manor and expansive greenhouse still reflected the prosperity that had shaped Ashbourne for generations. Callum parked outside the wrought iron entrance before introducing himself to the estate security attendant. After presenting his identification, he politely explained that he wished to examine the abandoned greenhouse in connection with newly recovered historical evidence. The attendant disappeared inside a small office before returning several minutes later with a respectful but firm answer. The estate manager appreciated the professionalism of the request, but access would not be granted without a judicial warrant. Callum thanked him without protest. Canadian law protected private property, and suspicion alone could never justify entering the grounds. As he walked back toward the patrol vehicle, he paused beside the roadside fence and studied the greenhouse from a distance through the trees. The building matched the structure visible in Marin Belrose's photograph almost perfectly. Its eastern wall faced a wooded slope descending toward a narrow conservation area behind the estate. The small maintenance path he had noticed in the photograph appeared almost completely hidden beneath years of overgrown vegetation. It was visible only for a few meters before disappearing behind cedar trees. Rather than forcing the investigation forward, Callum unfolded a municipal trail map stored inside his vehicle. The public conservation trail curved around the rear boundary of the estate before following a shallow creek that eventually passed within several hundred meters of Heritage Hill Cemetery. Quietly comparing the map with the old photograph, he began to wonder whether the route itself might reveal something overlooked during the original investigation. He clipped Bramble's tracking lead onto the harness before removing the sealed evidence bag containing the silver maple leaf necklace. The necklace remained protected inside its transparent forensic pouch. Callum did not remove it or contaminate the evidence. Instead, following standard K9 training procedures, he presented the sealed bag briefly to Bramble, allowing the dog to investigate the scent already preserved around the exterior packaging during earlier handling. Bramble sniffed the bag for several seconds before calmly lifting his head. "Search," Callum said quietly. The German shepherd immediately lowered his nose and began moving along the public trail rather than toward the estate itself. His pace remained steady, neither hurried nor uncertain. He was not choosing a destination from memory. He was simply following the strongest scent available within the environment. The trail descended gently through maple forest where damp leaves softened every footstep. After walking nearly 400 meters, Bramble slowed beside a narrow creek reduced to little more than flowing autumn water between smooth stones. He searched carefully along the bank, weaving between willow roots and fallen branches before stopping near a cluster of shrubs sheltered beneath an old cedar. His body became perfectly still. Then he sat, no digging, no barking, no dramatic movement. Only the calm, trained indication every police handler immediately recognized. Callum approached slowly and examined the ground without disturbing anything. Beneath several wet leaves, partly protected beneath a flat stone, rested a narrow strip of faded blue fabric. Using evidence gloves and sterile forceps from his investigation kit, he carefully lifted it into a clean evidence bag. Only then did he remove the old photograph once more. The young woman standing before the greenhouse wore a pale blue dress beneath her autumn coat. Along one sleeve, barely visible unless viewed closely, appeared delicate white embroidered flowers identical to those preserved on the recovered fabric. Callum did not assume they matched. That decision belonged to forensic examination, not instinct. Yet, as Bramble quietly returned to his side, the investigation had gained something far more valuable than certainty. It had gained another piece of physical evidence connecting the cemetery, the greenhouse, and the missing young woman through facts that could be tested rather than guessed. Callum returned to the Ashbourne Police Service with the newly recovered fabric carefully sealed inside a separate evidence bag. Before making another move, he submitted both the fabric and the silver maple leaf necklace to the Regional Forensic Laboratory for fiber comparison, trace analysis, and age assessment. Detective Sergeant Naomi Mercer reviewed the growing case file with quiet concentration. Spread across the conference table were the photograph from the tin box, the handwritten note, the cemetery recovery report, the archive file of Marin Belrose, and the new evidence collected beside the creek. Naomi remained thoughtful for several moments before speaking. "The investigation is moving in the right direction," she said calmly. "But we still need evidence connecting the Ashcroft estate itself to these discoveries before we can ask the court for a search warrant." Callum agreed. Every piece they possessed suggested a possible connection, but Canadian law required more than possibility. It required objective facts capable of standing inside a courtroom. That evening, instead of driving home, Callum found himself taking the familiar road toward the small brick house where his mother, Eleanor Whitaker, had spent nearly her entire life. The porch light still illuminated the front steps through a simple automatic timer, and the wind chime she had hung years earlier continued to sway gently beneath the covered entrance. Stepping inside always felt like entering a place where time had learned to move more slowly. The scent of cedar furniture, lavender soap, and old books remained exactly as he remembered. Bramble followed quietly behind him, moving through the living room with relaxed curiosity rather than searching behavior. He paused beside the fireplace before wandering toward Eleanor's oak writing desk beneath the front window. Callum smiled faintly. "You always liked this room, did you?" Bramble settled peacefully beside the desk, without further movement. Callum himself opened several drawers while searching for old family photographs that might remind him whether his mother had ever mentioned the Ashcroft estate. Instead, he discovered a neatly tied collection of handwritten notebooks. Eleanor had labeled most of them carefully. Church volunteers, community gardens, local history. The final notebook carried no title at all, Its pages contained observations collected over many years while volunteering throughout Ashbourne. They were not investigative reports. They were simply careful notes from someone who believed every conversation deserved to be remembered accurately. Callum slowly turned each page. Eleanor occasionally mentioned Maren Belrose, describing her as hardworking, kind, and devoted to caring for both Flowers and her widowed mother. One entry, written only days before Maren disappeared, drew his attention. Maren seemed worried today. She said someone from the estate asked her to meet after work at the greenhouse. She smiled, but her smile did not reach her eyes. Another page recorded a conversation with a retired heating contractor who had once repaired equipment on the Ashcroft property decades earlier. Eleanor wrote only a brief sentence beneath his name. He mentioned an old underground heating corridor beneath part of the greenhouse. Unsure whether it still exists. Needs verification. There were no maps. No detailed diagrams. No acquiescence. Only observations and unanswered questions. Near the back of the notebook, a folded municipal planning brochure from many years earlier slipped onto the desk. The printed map showed property boundaries surrounding the Ashcroft estate, but revealed little else. However, one handwritten pencil mark made by Eleanor circled the eastern side of the greenhouse beside the words, "Possible service access," followed by a question mark rather than a conclusion. Callum carefully compared the brochure with the old photograph already inside the evidence file. The handwritten circle aligned remarkably closely with the narrow maintenance path he had noticed behind Maren in the photograph. It was still only a possibility, but now two entirely separate sources pointed toward the same area. At that moment, Bramble quietly stood, stretched, and walked back toward the front door, waiting patiently without displaying any unusual reaction. Callum closed the notebook and looked around the quiet room, where his mother had once spent countless evenings writing down small details everyone else ignored. She had never solved the mystery. She had never claimed to know the answers. She had simply preserved observations that others considered too ordinary to matter. Now, combined with the growing physical evidence already collected, those ordinary observations might become exactly what the investigation needed to lawfully return to the abandoned greenhouse and continue following the truth wherever it chose to lead. The forensic laboratory completed its preliminary analysis 3 days later. Callum and Detective Sergeant Naomi Mercer reviewed the report together inside the evidence room, while Bramble rested quietly outside the office door. The findings did not solve the case, but they strengthened the investigation considerably. Microscopic examination confirmed that the recovered blue fabric and the fibers visible in Maren Belrose's archive photograph were consistent in color, weave, and manufacturing style commonly available during the same period. The laboratory could not declare them to be from the exact same garment, but the similarities were significant enough to support further investigation. Soil collected from the folded fabric also contained mineral traces matching the composition of the creek bank where it had been recovered. The silver maple leaf necklace displayed natural aging consistent with having remained underground for many years. None of the findings proved what had happened to Maren. Yet together, they transformed speculation into evidence worthy of judicial review. Armed with a forensic report, Eleanor Whitaker's handwritten observations, the archived missing person file, the handwritten note recovered beneath the unmarked grave, and the physical evidence collected during the investigation, Naomi and Callum appeared before a provincial judge to request a limited forensic search warrant for the abandoned Ashcroft greenhouse and its surrounding maintenance structures. The judge examined every document with deliberate care, asking detailed questions about the chain of custody, laboratory procedures, and the relationship between each piece of evidence. After several thoughtful minutes, he signed the warrant. The order authorized investigators to search only designated sections of the property directly connected to the recovered evidence. Nothing more, nothing less. By early afternoon, a small investigative team assembled outside the Ashcroft estate. Uniformed officers secured the perimeter while forensic specialists unloaded cameras, measuring equipment, evidence markers, and ground assessment tools. Gideon Ashcroft stood quietly near the entrance of the historic manor, supported by a polished walking cane. His expression remained composed despite the activity unfolding before him. When Callum presented the signed warrant, Gideon accepted the document, read it carefully, and simply nodded. "You have legal authority," he said calmly. "Please conduct your work with respect for the property." "You have my word," Callum replied. The greenhouse felt strangely peaceful despite years of neglect. Sunlight filtered through cracked glass panels while climbing ivy covered much of the stone foundation. Fallen leaves rested across abandoned planting beds where flowers had once grown. Every step echoed softly inside the empty structure. Bramble remained at heel until Callum received permission from the forensic team leader to begin a controlled scent search. Before giving any command, Callum again presented the sealed evidence bag containing the silver maple leaf necklace, allowing Bramble to refresh the scent already associated with the investigation. "Search," he said quietly. The German shepherd moved methodically through the greenhouse, nose close to the uneven stone floor, occasionally pausing before continuing. His pace remained patient and disciplined. He ignored broken benches, gardening equipment, and scattered debris. After several minutes, he stopped near the eastern side of the greenhouse where the old photograph and Eleanor's notes had both drawn Callum's attention. Bramble lowered his nose beside a section of cracked stone flooring, inhaled carefully, then sat without making another movement. His alert was calm, precise, and unmistakable. Callum did not assume the dog had found hidden passage. He simply marked the exact location with an evidence flag before stepping back. The forensic specialists immediately took over. Using structural inspection tools, they examined the surrounding stonework for irregularities. One investigator tapped gently across the floor with a sounding hammer, while another compared measurements against the original building plans recovered from municipal archives. A subtle difference in resonance appeared beneath one particular slab. Ground assessment equipment then revealed a hollow space beneath the foundation. Only after those independent findings confirmed an anomaly did the team carefully lift the heavy stone using specialized equipment. Beneath it rested an iron maintenance hatch almost completely concealed by decades of dust, roots, and compacted soil. Cool air drifted upward as the hatch slowly opened, revealing a narrow underground service corridor, supported by old stone walls. Several meters inside, investigators documented abandoned heating pipes, collapsed timber shelving, and scattered objects left untouched for many years. Among them lay an antique pocket watch engraved with the initials OV. Callum photographed the watch before it was carefully collected as evidence. He made no assumptions about its owner. Instead, he quietly noted one more verified fact. The investigation had not uncovered its final answer. It had uncovered the next question. The discovery of the underground service corridor transformed the investigation from a historical review into an active criminal inquiry. Every object recovered from beneath the greenhouse was photographed, measured, cataloged, and transferred through a documented chain of custody before leaving the estate. The antique pocket watch engraved with the initials O.V. drew immediate attention, but neither Callum nor Detective Sergeant Naomi Mercer allowed themselves to guess its significance. Initials alone could belong to many people. They needed facts, not assumptions. Back at the Ashbourne Police Service, the investigative team began tracing historical employment records connected to the Ashcroft estate. Municipal tax archives, payroll ledgers preserved by the county museum, and employment documents donated years earlier by the Ashcroft family gradually revealed a list of former estate staff. Only one long-serving employee matched the initials engraved inside the pocket watch. Osvin Vale, estate manager, 43 years of service before retiring more than 2 decades earlier. The name appeared repeatedly throughout maintenance records associated with the greenhouse heating system. Callum quietly closed the file. For the first time, the initials rested upon something verifiable instead of speculation. Locating Oswin required another 2 days. Provincial records showed that the 91-year-old former estate manager now lived in a modest assisted living residence overlooking the northern shore of Lake Ontario. The facility sat among quiet maple trees whose leaves had almost completely fallen with the arrival of early November. When Callum and Naomi arrived, they introduced themselves respectfully to the staff before requesting a voluntary interview. There was no warrant, no pressure, only a conversation. Bramble remained calmly beside Callum throughout the visit, wearing his working harness but showing none of the alert behavior that had marked the earlier stages of the investigation. His role here was simply that of a steady companion. Oswin welcomed them into a small, sitting room overlooking the lake. Aged bent his shoulders and softened his voice, yet his blue eyes remained remarkably clear. After exchanging a few polite words, Callum carefully placed the recovered pocket watch inside a transparent evidence sleeve on the table between them. The elderly man's expression changed almost immediately. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached toward the familiar object without touching it. "I have not seen that watch for many years," he whispered. "I wondered whether someone would eventually find it." Callum remained patient. "Mr. Vale, we are investigating the disappearance of Maren Belrose. We are not here to accuse you of anything. We are here because evidence has led us to believe you may know something that was never recorded." Oswin looked through the window for a long moment before quietly nodding. "I remember much of that autumn," he said. "Not every conversation, not every word, but enough." His statement was recorded with his full consent. He explained that Maren had been asked to meet Gideon Ashcroft inside the greenhouse after working hours. Rumors about her relationship with Julian Ashcroft had already begun spreading quietly through the town, and Gideon wanted the matter resolved away from public attention. Oswin remained outside for most of the meeting because he believed it concerned a private family matter. After some time, the conversation inside became louder, though he could not distinguish every sentence. Then everything suddenly became quiet. When Gideon called for him, Oswin entered the greenhouse and found Maren lying motionless beside an old stone potting bench after what appeared to have been a tragic fall during the emotional confrontation. Gideon stood nearby invisible, shock, repeating that he had never intended for events to unfold that way. Fear quickly overtook judgment. Instead of contacting authorities, Gideon pleaded with Oswin to help prevent a scandal that he believed would destroy both his family and the town's most respected name. Oswin lowered his head as he continued. "I should have refused. I know that now. But loyalty and fear can blind an ordinary man." He admitted that together they had carried Maren through the maintenance corridor during the night because the cemetery expansion left one burial site temporarily unmarked. Before leaving the greenhouse, Oswin noticed a silver maple leaf necklace near the doorway and later discovered the folded handwritten note inside Maren's coat pocket. He could not bring himself to destroy either item. Years later, burdened by regret, he sealed them inside the tin box and buried it beside the unmarked grave, believing that if he lacked the courage to speak, perhaps the truth might someday speak for itself. The room fell silent. Callum did not interrupt. The confession did not stand alone. It aligned with the physical evidence, the forensic findings, the archived records, and Eleanor Whitaker's observations. Piece by piece, the investigation had reached its most important witness, not because Bramble somehow knew the answer, but because one faithful dog's remarkable instinct had uncovered the first forgotten clue that allowed honest police work to uncover everything that followed. The days following Oswin Vale's recorded statement unfolded with quiet precision. Every word he had shared was carefully compared against the physical evidence already gathered. Investigators revisited the greenhouse, documenting measurements inside the underground service corridor and confirming that its entrance aligned with the eastern side of the structure exactly as described by both the retired estate manager and Eleanor Whitaker's handwritten observations. Forensic specialists also examined the old stone potting bench still preserved inside the abandoned greenhouse. Although 2 decades of time had erased countless details, the remaining physical layout proved consistent with the sequence Oswin had described. The investigation no longer relied upon memory alone. Independent evidence continued supporting the same narrative from multiple directions. Crown prosecutors reviewed the complete case file before authorizing a formal interview with Gideon Ashcroft. The elderly businessman arrived accompanied by legal counsel and entered the interview room with the quiet dignity of a man who understood that the past had finally caught up with him. Detective Sergeant Naomi Mercer led the questioning while Callum observed from across the table, occasionally consulting the evidence file. Bramble remained at the detachment with another certified handler. His work in the investigation had already been completed, and there was no reason to expose a working police dog to a formal legal interview. Naomi carefully presented the evidence one piece at a time. The handwritten note recovered beneath the unmarked grave, the silver maple leaf necklace, the historical missing person investigation, the forensic analysis connecting the recovered fabric to the same period as Marin's clothing, the underground service corridor documented beneath the greenhouse, the antique pocket watch recovered inside the passage. Finally, Oswin Vale's voluntary recorded statement. Gideon listened quietly without interruption. His lawyer occasionally requested clarification, but neither challenged the authenticity of the evidence presented. Several long minutes passed in complete silence before Gideon slowly removed his glasses and placed them upon the table. He looked not toward the investigators, but toward the autumn rain quietly sliding down the interview room window. "I have lived with that night every single day," he said softly. "Not because I feared prison, because I feared remembering who I became after it happened." His voice never rose. There was no attempt to justify what followed. He explained that he had invited Marin Belrose to the greenhouse because he believed ending her relationship with Julian would protect the Ashcroft family's reputation. Marin refused every offer to quietly leave Ashbourne. She insisted that Julian deserved to know the truth about their future together and that no child should begin life surrounded by lies. Their discussion became increasingly emotional. Gideon admitted that while attempting to stop her from walking away, both lost their balance near the uneven stone floor surrounding the old potting area. Marin fell unexpectedly and never regained consciousness. He stood frozen in disbelief, unable to accept what had happened. Panic soon replaced judgment. Rather than contacting emergency services or the police, he convinced himself that hiding the tragedy would somehow protect everyone involved. It became the greatest failure of his life. The formal statement ended only after every answer had been reviewed with legal counsel present. Several days later, Julian Ashcroft returned from British Columbia after investigators informed him that the historical case involving Marin Belrose had been resolved. Time had silvered his hair, but not the quiet sadness that still rested behind his eyes. Inside a private meeting room, Callum handed him a carefully protected copy of the photograph recovered from the tin box. Julian held it gently between both hands for several moments before speaking. She promised she would meet me after talking with my father, he whispered. I waited until the last train left that night. When she never came, I believed she had chosen another life. Callum quietly explained everything the investigation had uncovered. Julian closed his eyes as tears slowly gathered, not from anger, but from relief mixed with grief. For 20 years, he had believed the woman he loved had abandoned him without explanation. Now he finally understood that she had never stopped choosing honesty, even when honesty carried the greatest cost. Outside the station, the first light snow of the season drifted gently across the streets of Ashbourne. Callum stepped into the cold evening, where Bramble waited patiently beside the patrol vehicle after finishing his regular training exercises. The German shepherd looked up with calm amber eyes, completely unaware of court procedures, witness interviews, or legal documents. Yet without the single forgotten clue he had uncovered beneath an unmarked grave, none of those truths would ever have found their way back into the light. Several weeks later, the quiet hills surrounding Heritage Hill Cemetery welcomed the first gentle snowfall of the season. A thin blanket of white rested across the grass, softening every pathway and every weathered stone beneath the pale November sky. The investigation had reached its legal conclusion. Court records were amended. Maren Belrose's disappearance was no longer recorded as a voluntary departure. Her family finally received the truth they had never stopped believing. Near the eastern edge of the cemetery, where an unmarked stone had once stood alone beneath the cedar trees, a new granite headstone now carried Maren's full name. Fresh white lilies surrounded the grave, placed there by neighbors, church volunteers, and people who quietly admitted they had always questioned what happened but never possessed the courage or the evidence to challenge the official story. Julian Ashcroft stood quietly before the new headstone with his hands folded against the cold. Time had changed his face, but not the tenderness with which he looked at the woman he had spent 2 decades believing had abandoned him. In his coat pocket rested the restored silver maple leaf necklace. After speaking privately with Maren's remaining family, they had decided together that it should rest beside her once again. Julian gently placed the necklace inside a small memorial box prepared by the cemetery before stepping back, without saying another word. Some promises no longer needed voices. A short distance away, Gideon Ashcroft arrived supported by his walking cane. He wore a simple dark overcoat without any sign of the influence that had once surrounded his family. He removed his hat and stood silently before Maren's grave. He offered no defense and asked for no forgiveness. His formal statement had accepted responsibility for the decisions that followed the tragic accident, and the legal process had reached its conclusion. Yet standing before the newly engraved stone, he understood that some consequences remained beyond the reach of any courtroom. They belonged only to memory. When the gathering gradually dispersed, Callum Whitaker remained behind, carrying the same bouquet of white lilies he had first brought to the cemetery on the morning everything began. He slowly divided the flowers into 2 equal bundles. Half he placed beside Maren's grave. The remaining lilies he carried beneath the old sugar maple, where Eleanor Whitaker rested peacefully only a short walk away. For several quiet moments, he stood between the 2 graves, looking from one to the other. Without Eleanor's habit of carefully preserving small observations, the investigation might never have reached the threshold required for a lawful search. Without Bramble's remarkable instinct at the unmarked grave, those forgotten observations might never have been opened again. Neither had solved the mystery alone. Together, through kindness, patience, evidence, and honest police work, they had given the truth a second chance. Callum smiled gently as he rested one hand upon his mother's headstone. You taught me that every forgotten person deserves someone willing to keep asking questions, he whispered. You were right. Bramble walked quietly beside him before turning away from Eleanor's grave and making his way back toward Marin's resting place. He settled peacefully upon the snow-dusted grass, facing the new headstone with relaxed ears and calm amber eyes. There was no searching now, no agency, no scent trail waiting to be followed, only stillness. Callum watched his partner for a long moment before kneeling beside him. He remembered the frightened German shepherd puppy his mother had rescued years earlier beside a lonely country road, without expecting anything in return. One simple act of compassion had quietly echoed across decades, until it finally returned in the form of a faithful police dog who uncovered the first forgotten clue beneath an unmarked grave. Church bells drifted gently across the valley as light snow continued falling through the bright Canadian morning. The cedar branches swayed softly in the winter breeze, and the cemetery grew peaceful once more. Some stories end with triumph. Others end with understanding. This one ended with a name restored, a family reunited with the truth, a mother's quiet faith, fulfilled through her son, and a loyal German shepherd resting at last beside the place where his remarkable journey had truly begun.